In the 1930s, polling response rates were above 90%. Today, they're in the single digits.
Go into the polls and watch very carefully.
Why this drastic decrease? Northwestern professor Chloe Thurston says it's because landlines are well on their way to obsolete.
The way that many of these polls worked historically was that they would do something called random digit dialing of landlines, and that's how they could sort of ensure they have a random sample of voters. It's nice because the landlines are geographically based. And so it was great in a certain era, and it's much more problematic now.
Over 50% of U.S. households don't have a landline today, and random digit dialing for cell phones is banned in the U.S.
People are also leading more active lives. They're more likely to be out of the house.
So if no one is responding, where are pollsters getting their numbers?
It has to do with the application of statistical methods. Some of it results in what we call non-response weighting, comparing the characteristics of the people who responded to what we think are the characteristics of the people who didn't respond. And that's why we get this kind of modeled result rather than the simple aggregation.
In 2016, many polls anticipated a comfortable win for Hillary Clinton. That didn't happen, but those polls weren't entirely wrong. They did predict the popular vote.
National poll estimates of the popular vote were quite accurate, about as accurate as they've ever been. The state level estimates in many important states were statistically biased against Donald Trump.
So why did the states get it wrong?
Pre-election pollsters face a number of problems in doing their work. It begins with the fact that only a little bit more than half of Americans who are eligible actually go to vote. So they have to model what they call the likely electorate.
And this is where 2016 gets tricky.
The basic assumptions they often start with is that the electorate this time will look like the electorate last time. But 2016 had a couple of distinguishing features that were quite different from 2012.
What were those distinguishing features? For one, turnout in urban areas was down, which typically have more Democratic voters. Plus, there was an increase in college-educated people voting for Democrats, and an increase in people without a degree voting red. Now, in 2020, polls are being made with these changes in mind.
We think that the pollsters learned from that and have adjusted their weighting procedures and to some extent their sampling procedures for 2020.
The director of Suffolk University Political Research Center says COVID-19 has affected these procedures.
Response rates actually improved because of COVID-19. I think that's because people were just cooped up in their houses. They were miserable talking to the people in their own houses, and they wanted to talk to some fresh new voice, I suppose.
This cycle of learning isn't new for pollsters, Thurston says.
We think about historically some of the really important advances in polling. They kind of happen after there's a controversy about a really poorly done but popular poll.
And history repeats itself.
A really prominent example of this, before the birth of modern polling in sort of the 1930s, people would go to this magazine called Literary Digest for election prediction. And the Literary Digest did a great job. They're very accurate in predicting election outcomes.
But in 1936, they failed to predict FDR's win.
Not everyone has a phone in the 1920s and 1930s. I think might skew towards a certain part of the population.
Literary Digest oversampled wealthier populations, so their likely electorate was wrong. Similar to 2016, the Digest lost their credibility, but it wasn't all bad.
So out of that came, some soul searching, but also much more hunger for, sort of a more scientific basis for polling.
Failures turned lessons. The future of polling is right around the corner. Vanessa Kelson, Northwestern News Network.